Just over 10 days ago, the night sky over Caracas was ripped apart by the roar of Delta Force rotors. In a matter of hours, Nicolás Maduro, the man who had ruled Venezuela for 13 years, went from the master of the presidential palace to a federal inmate in a jumpsuit. The whole world is asking the same question: how did the US have the audacity to invade sovereign soil and snatch a head of state? Was it for oil? Was it for democracy? And why now, in 2026? The answer is more complex, and colder, than you might think. This wasn't just a military operation, it was the violent conclusion to a century-long saga of love and hate. And it all begins on the day a cup of coffee was replaced by oil. To understand all this, we must first dispel a misconception: the relationship between the US and Venezuela has never been merely a transaction, but a physical lockdown. The story begins before World War II. When Venezuelans discovered that the black gold beneath their feet was more valuable than coffee beans, the country developed a severe oil dependency. By 1935, oil accounted for more than 90% of total exports. But there's a crucial technical detail often overlooked: Venezuelan oil isn't ordinary oil. It's extremely viscous, with a very high sulfur content, and at room temperature, it's practically as hard as asphalt. This leads to an interesting situation: the vast majority of the world's refineries simply can't handle this heavy oil. Who could? The United States. Back in the 1950s, driven by the need for energy security, refineries along the U.S. Gulf Coast underwent a massive overhaul. Billions were poured into retrofitting equipment specifically designed to process Venezuelan heavy crude. Think of it like a custom-made plug and socket. Venezuela held the world's largest heavy oil reserves, and the U.S. possessed the only complex machinery capable of handling it at scale. This hardware-level lock-in created a bond far stronger than any diplomatic treaty ever could. Even when Venezuela moved to nationalize its oil industry in 1976, forming the famous PDVSA, the separation was remarkably amicable: gentlemen's breakup. There was no bloodshed, no seizure of assets. The Venezuelan government cut massive checks to compensate Exxon and Mobil, then immediately turned around and hired those same American companies back as technical consultants. By the 1980s, this entanglement went even deeper. Venezuela's PDVSA acquired the American brand Citgo. This wasn't just about snapping up thousands of gas stations, it was a strategic masterstroke to acquire the very refineries built to handle their heavy crude. Commercially, it was genius. Venezuela wasn't just selling the oil anymore, they now owned their biggest customer right on U.S. soil. Fueled by American technology and capital, Venezuelan oil production hit its all-time peak in 1998. At the time, both Washington and Caracas believed this marriage, built on geological realities and steel pipelines, would last forever. That is, until the man in the red beret arrived on the scene. In 1999, Venezuela didn't just get a president, they got a showman, Hugo Chávez. To Chávez, politics was reality TV, and the United States was cast as the perfect villain. The world still remembers his performance at the 2006 UN General Assembly. Pointing to the podium where George W. Bush had just stood, he called the American president the devil, theatrically sniffing the air and declaring it still smelled of sulfur. That act of radical defiance turned him into a global icon of anti-imperialism. But here lies the twist of magical realism. At the very moment Chávez was in New York denouncing the imperialist devils, his supertankers were steaming full speed ahead toward Louisiana and Texas. No matter how fiery his televised rants became, 1.2 to 1.5 million barrels of crude continued to flow north every single day. It brings to mind a famous paradox: anti-Americanism is the job, selling oil is the life. Chávez was effectively using American dollars to bankroll his anti-American, Bolivarian utopia. The U.S. wasn't just his enemy, it was his biggest financier. This absurd equilibrium was propped up entirely by oil prices that were skyrocketing to $100, even $140 a barrel. However, this balance came with a price. After a failed coup in 2002, Chávez grew deeply paranoid, convinced the CIA was out to get him. The national oil strike from late 2002 to early 2003 marked the point of no return. In a move to crush resistance within PDVSA, the state oil company, he made a fatal decision, a massive purge. In one fell swoop, he fired 18,000 top engineers and managers, the literal brain trust of Venezuela's oil industry. He replaced these technocrats with political loyalists who knew how to chant slogans but not how to run a refinery. This triggered two long-term disasters. First, production began an irreversible, slow-motion collapse, though high prices masked the volume drop. Second, the investment climate was incinerated. Chávez seized assets from ExxonMobil and ConocoPhillips, driving U.S. giants out and severing capital ties. All that remained was a transactional relationship. Yet, Chávez was lucky. The global commodities supercycle generated astronomical windfalls that papered over the structural rot within the industry. Imagine kicking every trained pilot out of the cockpit of a Boeing 747 mid-flight and replacing them with your fan club. The plane might keep gliding for a while on inertia, and high oil prices, but the engines were already flaming out. Chávez had the devil's own luck. He passed away just before the oil market crashed, leaving the bill for the party, and a hollowed-out industry, to his successor. So, why did this cold politics, hot economy dynamic survive for so long? It came down to hard reality. U.S. Gulf refineries were technically addicted to Venezuelan heavy crude. This is the key difference between the Chávez era and the Maduro era. The U.S. shale revolution hadn't happened yet. Back then, the U.S. was still the world's largest oil importer. Sanctioning Venezuela would have spiked global oil prices, which for any U.S. president is political suicide at the gas pump. Washington was also bogged down in the post-9/11 war on terror, viewing Chávez as a noisy nuisance in the backyard rather than a military threat. Meanwhile, Chávez needed instant cash for his social programs. As long as the trade continued, the U.S. held a quiet leverage, keeping Venezuela tethered to the dollar-based financial system, preventing a total drift toward Cuba, Iran, or Russia. Nicolás Maduro lacked Chávez's charisma, and worse, he lacked his luck. He took the wheel just as global oil prices crashed in 2014. For a nation relying on crude for 95% of its income, this wasn't a recession, it was a freefall. With the treasury empty, the Maduro government made the most suicidal decision in economics: they printed money like crazy. The result was one of the most insane episodes of hyperinflation in modern history. The currency, the bolivar, became worth less than monopoly money. You literally needed a wheelbarrow full of cash just to buy a single chicken. But this wasn't just cold economic data, it was a living hell. Venezuelans coined a dark joke: the Maduro diet. It wasn't a fitness trend. It was starvation. The average Venezuelan lost 19 pounds in a single year. In a country that was once the wealthiest in South America, toilet paper, milk, and antibiotics became luxury goods. When survival is the question, the only answer is, run. This triggered the Great Exodus that would eventually explode into U.S. politics. About 7.7 million Venezuelans fled their homes. To put that in perspective, a quarter of the population simply evaporated. It was an unprecedented migration in the Western Hemisphere, eclipsing the refugee crises in Syria and Ukraine. Facing this chaos, Maduro cracked down hard, and Washington's attitude began to shift. In 2015, President Obama signed an executive order declaring Venezuela an unusual and extraordinary threat to U.S. national security. While legally just a technicality to enable sanctions, Maduro took it as a declaration of war. His response was total militarization. He handed control of the oil companies, the mines, and even food distribution over to army generals. This wasn't just about suppressing dissent, it was about buying loyalty. From that moment on, Venezuela ceased to be merely a mismanaged country and became a failed state run by the military, exporting nothing but refugees and instability. By 2015, the game had changed on the American side, too. The U.S. shale revolution was a massive success. America was becoming a net energy exporter, and Venezuelan heavy crude was no longer a must-have. As the Obama era ended, the fragile balance broke. Obama, a believer in multilateralism who wanted to avoid another Iraq-style quagmire, had avoided direct intervention. He preferred surgical sanctions targeting the assets of corrupt officials to trigger an internal coup. But the political climate in the U.S. was shifting. Republicans saw the propaganda value of Venezuela's collapse. They weaponized Venezuela as a terrifying political symbol to attack the democratic socialism of figures like Bernie Sanders. Venezuela was no longer just a foreign policy issue, it was a proxy war for American domestic ideology. This polarization forced Washington's policy to detach from geopolitical reality and run on the logic of partisan warfare. In 2017, Maduro created a Constituent Assembly to bypass the opposition-led Congress, a move Washington saw as the final step toward dictatorship. The Trump administration responded with financial sanctions, cutting off financing for the government and PDVSA. This triggered a debt default, leaving Venezuela with no money to repair its aging oil fields. Production plummeted. Then came the historic turning point, the 2019 total oil embargo. The U.S. recognized opposition leader Juan Guaido as interim president and slapped severe sanctions on PDVSA, effectively banning Venezuelan oil imports. A century of oil trade hit zero overnight. Venezuela was forced into the shadows. They turned to the black market, using ghost fleets to ship oil to Asia, disguising it as Malaysian blend for independent Chinese refineries. Because their oil is so heavy, they needed diluents to move it through pipelines. Since the U.S. stopped selling them these chemicals, Venezuela had to turn to Iran, swapping gold and crude for Iranian condensate. The U.S. began acting as the maritime police, seizing tankers and threatening Russian energy giants like Rosneft until they pulled out. Trump, with his transactional style and desire to erase Obama's legacy, shifted from pragmatism to maximum pressure, a policy heavy on performance art. The administration tried to create a myth of quick victory by suffocating the economy. But this unilateral approach underestimated the regime's resilience. Instead of collapsing, Maduro was pushed entirely into the arms of Beijing and Moscow, setting the stage for the crises to come. As we entered the 2020s, Washington found itself trapped in a painful bind, essentially fighting a war with itself. Early in the Biden presidency, the Russian invasion of Ukraine threw global energy markets into chaos. Desperate to stabilize oil prices, the U.S. was forced back to the negotiating table. Biden tried the traditional carrot-and-stick approach: we offer sanctions relief, you give us oil and free elections. That is why, in 2022, you saw Chevron return to Venezuela. It was an incredibly complex arrangement known as oil for debt. On paper, the sanctions remained, but in reality, the U.S. greenlit a specific, controlled flow of crude, hoping to lure Maduro back into the Western orbit. But Maduro played everyone. He took the candy, a temporary boost in oil revenue, but refused to let go of power. The 2024 election turned into a complete farce. Biden's policy of engagement collapsed. Yet, that wasn't even the fatal blow. The straw that finally broke the camel's back wasn't oil. It was the border. Venezuela's economic implosion sent millions of people surging toward the U.S. southern border. This stopped being just a Texas problem. The wave of migrants spilled over into Democratic strongholds like New York City and Chicago. Even more terrifying, embedded within this desperate migration were criminal elements, specifically, the notorious gang, Tren de Aragua. Suddenly, the Venezuela problem wasn't just a distant diplomatic puzzle anymore. It had morphed into a public safety nightmare right on the American voter's doorstep. When Donald Trump reclaimed the White House after the 2024 election, he faced a nation seething with anger. His new inner circle, anchored by the fiercely hawkish Marco Rubio, reached a stark conclusion: sanctions were dead. Maduro had successfully constructed a sanctions-proof economy, built on the back of smuggled oil to Asia and narcotics trafficking. The logic in the Situation Room was brutal but simple: as long as Maduro sat on the throne, the river of migrants and drugs flowing north would never stop. And so, the script was flipped. Washington stopped treating Maduro as a rogue president and started treating him as a transnational crime boss. The Department of Justice painted a picture of a narco-state, alleging that Venezuela's top brass had colluded with Colombian guerrillas to turn their country into a cocaine superhighway aimed straight at American streets. Then came the dawn of January 3, 2026. The U.S. launched Operation Absolute Resolve. In a lightning raid on Caracas, Delta Force operators captured Nicolás Maduro and his wife. The official line from Washington was chillingly precise: Maduro was no longer an illegitimate president, he was an incarcerated kingpin. Extradited to New York, he now faces federal charges for narco-terrorism and crimes against humanity. Make no mistake, this wasn't a war for oil. It was a surgical extraction designed to stop the bleeding. For the Trump 2.0 administration, the only way to sever the root of the migrant and drug crisis was to physically remove the man at the top. The doors of diplomacy had been welded shut, the only tool left was the battering ram of special forces. Maduro's imprisonment marks a violent resurrection of the Monroe Doctrine. While international law experts cry foul, for Trump, this is a victory lap that solidifies his legend among his base. And despite his rhetoric about seizing the oil, the reality is different. American energy giants remain cool to the idea, wary of the astronomical costs and political chaos required to rebuild Venezuela's crumbling infrastructure. In the end, it was a structural deadlock. For Maduro, hating America was a survival strategy, a way to rally loyalty and court support from China, Russia, and Iran. For Washington, his regime had mutated into a nexus of drug trafficking and geopolitical hostility. While there were moments of tactical pauses, swapping prisoners or trading oil, the fundamental truth remained: the knot was too tight to untie. It had to be cut. The story of Venezuela teaches us a brutal lesson: in geopolitics, there are no permanent friends and no permanent enemies, only permanent interests. When the priorities of giants shift, the fate of smaller nations turns on a dime. For the United States, capturing Maduro was neither difficult nor truly existential. But for the people of Venezuela, it is momentous. Yet, we must ask, is this salvation? No one truly knows what happens next. Will those 8 million displaced souls ever find their way home? That is the single greatest question mark left to history.